Good afternoon, everyone. SF Tech Council is what we call a multi-sector collaborative. So we're working across sectors, bringing leaders from organizations in those sectors together to share information and collaborate around digital inclusion activities for older adults and adults with disabilities. So we were founded in 2015, thanks to Ann Hinton and Marie Jobling and other individuals in San Francisco who at the time saw some broadband policy as both a challenge, but an opportunity, to work together to ensure that older adults and individuals with disabilities were not left behind in the digital age. And so our organization constitutes 24 member organizations who do a lot of programming in the community in terms of computer training and refurbishment, and also advocacy for funding and policy that's more supportive of digital inclusion for both of these. So we're really like a community table where people convene and come together for the explicit purpose of focusing on digital inclusion. So this state digital equity plan is a major opportunity for our organizations and the community of San Francisco to look at how we can ensure that more funding and resources are made available to address digital equity for both of these populations.
All right, so the California Digital Equity Plan draft. I just want to emphasize that word draft. It's all over the thing. This is not the final, and that's why we're talking about it, because we do still have an opportunity to impact the content, if not the framing of some of the items in this report. Just to give you a sense as to how it fits into what will happen next. So this draft plan has been a long time in the making, well over a year in terms of the actual, even the research, the engagement. But now we're kind of at a turning point. So December 13th is when it was released, so a week ago today, and it is open for 45 days of public comment. That brings us to January 25th, 2024. So it's good we have January to take a look at it. The next phase of this process is when the California Department of Technology, that is CDT, will integrate public comments into this report. The NTIA curing process. Now, NTIA is the federal entity that will take a look at all of these digital equity plans coming from all of the states and sort through them and start assigning funding. The final SDEP will be published, and if you see on the bottom of the screen, that looks like end of Q1, beginning of Q2. What we're all in this for, and why we're invested, is that funding opportunities based on this plan will start to become available in Q3 and 4, especially of 2024. So the capacity grant and the competitive grant. The competitive grant opportunities will be administered at the federal level. The capacity grants will be administered at the state level. There's certainly more complexity there, but that gives you just a general sense of how it's all going to work. Am I missing anything on that, Andrew?
Yeah, so I think just once the plan is finalized, implementation of the plan will come through the capacity grant funding. So as Carla said, that will flow to Sacramento first before. We're not clear yet on what the process will be in Sacramento, or what criteria will be used in terms of allocating the funding for capacity building. But the NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, will contain a lot of the information that will direct Sacramento and other states in how they should, use the funding in relation to the plans that they have developed.
Great. some of you have seen this information before, some of you haven't. This plan is the result of a very intensive engagement process by the California Department of Technology beginning last winter. Many of you may have been at some of the early statewide planning meetings. At any rate, there was all these different components have gone into it. A statewide planning group, outcome area working groups, a number of surveys, all of the which we advocated and asked you in particular and your organizations to help with the online consumer-facing survey and the digital equity ecosystem mapping tool, DEAM. Then there were regional and local planning sessions. So all of this information is throughout the year has been recorded and compiled. Now, if you want dates and times of all of these interactions, they're at the end in one of the 25 appendices to this report. So you can see exactly when they happened. I was noticing that even some of your names are showing up in that appendices in terms of meetings. What's important for our purposes is a lot of the material in the report, or in terms of the recommendations, the barriers, the needs, were gleaned from the telephone survey responses and the online responses, as well as these organizational DEAM surveys. Now, the telephone survey responses, I need to do a little circle around that. These were more statistically targeted. So half a randomized sample, and then half were from the targeted covered populations. So in terms of statistically significant, although the number is smaller, these may be more significant. That's
Yeah.
because anybody who wanted to could fill out the other surveys.
Yeah, and so Carla, like on the other survey where there were over 40,000 kind of
Yeah.
respondents, 10,000 of those came from San Diego only. So just to give you a sense that, you know, a lot of what was captured through the online survey may not be representative of the state as a whole. So.
Right. That exactly right. These are a couple of takeaways that I just wanted to share from these different surveys. This is the telephone survey and what they learned in terms of the 8 covered populations, which we'll talk about. So the biggest and one that is most significant for us is that 91% of Californians are connected. That doesn't mean that all of them are well connected in terms of having reliable, fast internet. The number goes down for that. But this is a number that I don't think before the pandemic anybody thought we would reach. Also, if you take a look at the next 2 highest connectivity levels are people with disabilities and older residents. And so, and I've got some more information on that piece as well.
Yeah. And Carla, I would just add that the telephone survey was fielded by the California Emerging Technology Fund.
Yep.
And every 2 years, they do a survey like this on broadband, you know, access, etc. So it's a continuation of an existing survey. So a lot of the data points that they can point back to, like in 2021 versus 2023, and there were significant improvements for people with disabilities and older residents in the amount or the level of connection or connectivity that both those populations had relative to 2 years ago.
And as I'm looking at this slide, I would like to point out, and many of you again today are familiar with this statistic, that most people who are eligible for the Affordable Connectivity Program are not aware of it. They just still don't know that it exists. And so that has been a real issue.
Yeah.
This is one of the slides I wanted to point out from the telephone survey that they learned. This is using what USC did and the California Emerging Technology Fund. over almost the past decade, so starting in 2014. This is broadband adoption by disability status. And so the blue line is for people who identify as having or living with a disability. And if you take a look, it was below 60% in 2014, and it is now a little over 90% in 2023. So pretty remarkable change in that picture. This is also the case with adults aged 60 and over. These two populations have made the greatest strides in connectivity. So that's good news for us. So the same thing, 2014, under 50% of individuals age 60 and over were connected, to 91% in 2023. So when you take a look at the other age groups, people, and actually this is 65 and over, have made the greatest strides. In terms of the public facing survey that was online, and this is the one that many of you filled out, and we asked you to bring it to your clients and people you work with, and it was unruly, of course. It was long, but we just want to provide some information on that. I mentioned that there are over 43,000 responses to this survey, only 36,273 valid responses. Now, how do they determine whether something is valid or not? It's if the individual filled out enough questions that had anything to do with digital equity. So they may have given a location, they may have given some other information, but if they didn't respond to questions about digital equity, then they were excluded from the survey because they didn't tell us anything. Another important piece about this in terms of languages of responses, this survey was made available in 14 different languages. In terms of responses, 91% were in English, then another 6% in Spanish, 3% in Chinese, and that includes traditional and simplified, less than 1% for all the others put together. So making it available in many languages did not generate the numbers that people had hoped. Andrew, do you want to talk a little bit about the covered populations distribution on the right?
Yeah, so as part of the state plan, there are 8 covered populations, aging individuals. I won't name them all, but there were 2 more added by the state of California. But we had very high representation among aging individuals, that is over the age of 60. So 53% of the respondents came from, if I'm reading that correct, Carla, is it 53%
Yes.
came from that kind of covered population, when they only represent 20% of the population of California. And so looking at all of the other kind of populations that are listed here was the kind of most sampled for the online survey.
And individuals with disabilities, a similar situation, making up 11% of California's population, but 20% of the responses were from individuals with disabilities. Now, there are some issues with this because some of the groups are not well represented in terms of racial and ethnic minority groups. They make up 64% of California's population, but only 44% of the respondents. In addition, the survey doesn't tell us which racial or ethnic groups they are. So we're not sure. So that kind of gives you a sense. We'll share this out afterwards so you can take a look at this, and it's also in the report. When you take a look at the digital equity plan itself, it's divided into 7 categories. This first chunk, the executive summary, takes up about the first 30 pages or so, and this is where you'll get the broadest overview of what the report is about. If you continue on into some of these additional sections, it becomes pretty confusing because the information is repeated and then expanded upon. So you feel like you're reading the same report over and over again as you move through the sections because they expand on different aspects of it. Entire project for this Digital Equity Act really and focused on these 8 covered populations. These were dictated at the federal level. And so it was a requirement that states consider a focus on these populations. California added 3 additional groups to these 8. So when you hear 8 covered, but you see 11, that's that's where they come from. So members of the LGBTQIA community, individuals who identify as women or females, and tribal communities. Another interesting piece of information is that in total, 33.5 million Californians, or 85% of the state's population, belong to one or more of these populations. This is the framework that the report or the draft plan is created in. They've got a vision, then they have developed goals, and they've got 3 goals. Under each goal, you're going to see a variety of objectives, anywhere from like 4 to 6 objectives. So you'll have goal 1, and then it'll be 1.1, 1.2. In one section of the report, you'll see the goal, what they're measuring, and then they'll tell you where we're at right now as a state. They will also provide some targets for where they hope to be at the end of they use different dates, but sometimes 2 years, sometimes 4 years, sometimes 5 years, depending on how ambitious the goal is. And there are also a list of key strategies and activities. Strategies are the more general part, and activities get to be pretty specific. And these are kind of interesting because these give us a sense of what kinds of things might be funded in terms of the capacity and competitive grants. Go ahead, Andrew.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, this report also includes a section on the assets that we have as a state in terms of legislation, programming, those kinds of things, down to the local level. So in this report, the San Francisco Tech Council is listed, and so is the Bay Area Digital Inclusion Coalition, BADIC. And among other local organizations, many of your organizations are listed. When I went through the list, I saw Self-Help for the Elderly, I saw Community Living Campaign, I saw Conard, I saw a number of others. In fact, 26 organizations that serve populations in San Francisco City and County are listed in those assets. So that's a real plug to us.
You know, it's important to note the 3 goals are from the Broadband for All policy that California had that predates the State Digital Equity Plan. So what the State Digital Equity Plan tries to do is kind of align or pair with the Broadband for All investments and the strategies that it has identified. So just to make that clear, that this isn't kind of in isolation, but it's trying to leverage an existing policy. And, you know, it kind of mirrors that with the goals and some of the strategies that will be outlined in the report.
Okay. And just one last thing, there's a section in there that focuses on priority outcome areas. So it's not just about getting people connected, getting devices, and developing digital skills. It's about how those assets are used, and to do key things that people need to in the state of California. So in education, in health, digital literacy and inclusion, workforce development, essential services, and tribal collaboration. This is just a page that shows you a little bit more closely how this will work itself out. So you'll see like goal 2, and then you'll have the objective on the left, the current baseline, the target, and the key activities. And this can be found in the executive summary. And it's worth taking a look at just a couple of these pages just so you can kind of get a real general sense. Now I want to move into just some of the barriers, because this is where I think we'll have some opportunities to make some comments and to provide some feedback. These are listed as the top barriers that organizations face based on the organizational Dean Tool survey. So, and this, I think, and when Andrew and I looked at, is closely aligned with what many of you told us in interviews over the past 6-7 months that we conducted. So, funding and sustainability. So over and over again, and I'm glad that the state has heard that because it is very much true. Staff and organizational capacity, again, what we heard down the line in San Francisco, adequately trained staff, and often going back to funding and sustainability, being able to adequately pay employees in markets like San Francisco. Difficulty accessing and applying for funding. We're all in the middle of this. They are complicated. They have a lot of requirements, and the complexity of applying for and reporting is just overwhelming for many of our organizations. It takes a big chunk of our time. And finally, lack of awareness and engagement about what's actually out there. And this is both for organizations and for people who need the services of organizations.
And Carla, I would just say, the Dean tool is maybe how they collected this information about the organizations. And I believe the Dean tool, they're still open to organizations submitting to that. So if your organization has not already, maybe that's an opportunity to kind of get yourself included into that database, because what we've learned through this process and talking with the state is, the organizational aspects and the collaboration between organizations are going to be key in terms of how they disperse funding for capacity building, for example. So just getting on their radar is maybe the first step through the Dean tool.
That Deem tool is available until January 25th. And again, it's really long, but you don't have to fill it all out. Just fill out the parts that are relevant to you about digital equity, just to get your name and organization on the map. It can only help. A big chunk of the report is about barriers. That was one of the things that through all of the surveys and listening sessions and meetings that the state was interested in learning more about. What were the general barriers for individuals in terms of what they encounter in terms of digital equity? And those barriers are divided into 3 categories. And Andrew mentioned these just weren't picked from out of the blue. They've been trying to track these for a long time. So the first one has to do with access. This one has more to do with infrastructure, like is there broadband available, fiber to housing initiatives, things like that. The second one has to do with affordability of access, and devices. So can you afford internet? Do you know about ACP? Are you signed up for it? Can you afford the kind of device that you actually need and that will work for you? And the third category in terms of barriers is adoption. And this is really big. And a lot of us, in terms of what our organizations do, are really in that adoption work, providing digital literacy and skills training, and helping people use the devices they have. And so this is, and that all has to do with adoption, what people do with it. There are, in the report, a couple of things that they list under each of those for general barriers. Then they look at each of the covered populations and they talk about key barriers. And so I just wanted to point out a couple of these, and these show up regularly. And this is where I think we could, where we may have room to make some further comment. So and these are, I believe, starting on page 60 of the report. So if you open into that section, and I'll show you some pages from it as well, but these covered populations, so aging individuals 60 plus, I don't know if that's the terminology that I would have chosen, considering we're all aging individuals, but it is what it is. These are the examples of specific barriers. The first one they list every time they mention individuals age 60 and over is lack of perceived need. I've copied this directly from the plan. The second is inadequate devices and technology. And the third is lack of digital skills training. Now, they do not necessarily define what lack of perceived need is. In doing some tracking this down, it seems to mean that more older adults are using smartphones, and by their use of a smartphone, they don't necessarily are not getting, broadband. There's no data to back this up, however, and it doesn't, and that it's any higher than for any other population. And what concerns us at an initial read through is that this is the first item listed, and I think it can be misleading. We'll get to that shortly. The second group that we're looking at, individuals with disabilities. These are the top three barriers listed for this population: inadequate accessible hardware and software, training on hardware and software, and accessibility of online services. And so all of these are all important. Now, because there are 8 different populations, there is some intersection. So there are a couple of other populations where some of the needs that we see regularly might be addressed. So when they look at individuals who live in covered households that are under the 150% of federal poverty level, they list these barriers: lack of awareness of low-cost offers in ACP, availability in multi-dwelling units and subsidized housing. We see this all the time in San Francisco. Individual units within MDUs and subsidized housing are not accurately counted on federal and state broadband maps. And industry business practices constrain service availability and options where multiple families reside in the same unit. So what they're talking about here is that even if a family or a dwelling unit has Wi-Fi, it may not be sufficient to meet the needs of all those family members who are using it. So it's really not as useful as it might seem at first. 2 more populations that intersect in particular with either with aging in San Francisco and individuals with disabilities. So what I'd like you to take a look at is these are identical. Individuals with language barriers and individuals who are members of a racial or ethnic minority group, they have the exact same barriers for both. And so it seems as if by not identifying what these different barriers are, they don't indicate which languages, and they don't indicate which members, which racial or ethnic groups. The other thing is that the first barrier that they indicate, I think, is problematic. I think order counts, mistrust of government and corporations, I think is a factor, but in the work, in talking with all of you and through our interviews, that did not come up as the top issue for individuals in these covered populations. Any comments? Fiona.
I'll go first. Um, I did have a clarifying question, I guess. What is the difference between a capacity building grant and What competitive grant? I was curious.
Andrew, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so the capacity building grants will go mainly to a lot of anchor institutions in the community. So like health systems, government agencies, libraries, etc. Again, it's not clear what criteria in terms of who's eligible that will come through the NOFO in terms of more specifics, but the grants will then be kind of allocated through the state. So I think it's kind of critical to think about who you know in the state and start advocating, for some of this funding as it will come indirectly through California to the community. The competitive grants are kind of open to organizations, but it's going to be competitive nationally because you'll be applying to the federal agency NTIA
Okay.
and competing against a lot of other organizations for the same
Hmm.
monies.
Okay. And do we know how much of I guess after NTIA reviews, the
But
final
total,
plan
yeah,
will know what our
yeah,
allocation is going to be roughly?
yeah. We don't know like what California will get, say, for capacity building grants, but we do know for the state plan they got about 6.7% of the total funding. So it could be formula based in terms of allocation for capacity building and what each state will get. But it's not clear yet. So,
Yeah. Okay.
but there's about $1.4 billion in that pot. So
Yeah.
total, and then
Hmm.
in the competitive grants, it's a little lower. So yeah, but
Yeah.
total 2.7 billion. Yeah.
All right, oh, Jin, jump in.
Hi, Carla. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
great presentation and great breakdowns of the whole plan. I mean, like it's over 100 pages, so it's very long for us to even for
Mm-hmm.
me to digest it. But I know that for the Deem survey, we actually engaged a bunch of seniors who are SF Connected participants in completing it. That's probably why we contributed a very little fraction of that 3% in other language in that survey. That's what I'm understanding. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
looking at the public comments form right now, and my question is that whether or not Tech Council will be submitting one, like representing of the partners that were under this coalition to address any comments on a particular chapter of the plan, or no? Will we just doing it individually?
Yes, we will. And we want you to as well. So we will try to send out in the new year a little bit of a cheat sheet, because here's the website. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
So here's where you can see, you can read the draft plan, download it. There's two pieces then: public comment, leave a comment, and submitted public comment. So you can actually read what's out there. And what I understand and what the state has communicated to us is that um, we can really make a dent in this or change some of the framing of or language or the way things are done through this public comment feature. So let me show you really quick how this works. So you'll click here. You will, and this is important, you can do it as an individual or as an organization. So lots of ways to get comments in where you're asked for your first name, last name, email, and city. They want to know if you're in California and your zip code. And I think that'll be important regionally. Do you identify with any of these populations? And you can select more than one. And then you still find a selection to provide a comment. So it could be on the executive summary, in introduction, appendices, or not related to the above sections. So if you did this, for example, and it would be attached to it, if you're not sure, you can make general comments, and you can comment on many sections. So if you go down, comment on another section, and you can go down and do more of them. One interesting feature is it does allow voice to text comment. And so I think that is a key piece. In terms of language, I'm assuming that if you go into one of the things they talked about is if you do the Google Translate, you can get it in other languages as well. And that's at the upper right-hand corner of your screen. So it is probably important, especially on some of these things, if we feel strongly enough about it, that yes, SF Tech Council will, but it would be great for others to do similar kinds of things, and we can provide guidance on that. Fiona, again, oops.
Yes, sorry, sorry. I realized I did have another question. My real question, really. So a subgroup of us did this, partnered with the Tech Council and did this
Mhm.
plan for San Francisco that was funded by the Meta Fund and all that. It was like a
Mhm.
6 month effort. So I was curious, like where, I mean, and this doesn't have to have a specific answer, but like where in this draft plan do you see some of that work, and like sort of what's the outcome of that, and how do you think that that effort informed this this product, if you will?
Well, if you in there they indicate conversations with the Tech Council, they indicate conversations with many of you. Also, in terms of the Tech Council, the final product for the plan we've been working on will be available right at the beginning of January, and there are pieces of it that we can actually use to submit within this, as part of comment. So I think it'll have that function as well. So in terms of all of the participation that you've worked with us, many of us, it has showing up in different pieces of it. What's interesting, however, though, is that it looks as if, this is a quick aside, that rural areas were far oversampled in this, for both the telephone survey and the online survey, which means that many of the recommendations don't reflect where the majority of older adults in San Francisco live, which is a real problem, because a lot of the things that we learned in our process, in terms of older adults and adults with disabilities, aren't showing up in this report. So I think that that's an interesting area to be able to tackle as we go through with this.
Yeah, I think Fiona, when you look at the report, you'll see it's written in very general, high-level language in terms of talking about individuals who are aging or people living with disabilities, and it's not localized in any way to say in San Francisco or, different kind of geographic locations. So it's very general, high level.
Okay. This is the report itself. Can everybody see my
Mm-hmm.
screen? Great.
Yeah.
So it gives you kind of a sense. So where it starts talking about older adults very specifically is page 76. And this is a section 3, I believe, but page 76 is where you'll jump to. Now, this is how it starts in terms of specific barriers, the ones I pointed out before. And it indicates different groups that they've worked with. Tech Council's there, Bay Area Digital Equity Coalition. We need to send in a correction. That's the Digital Inclusion Coalition, Community Tech Network, OATS. So we are listed there. And also interviews with Self-Help for the Elderly are indicated in this. Here's where we see that paragraph again, including a lack of perceived need and a lack of adequate devices and technology. And this seems to me not to, I guess there's a couple of ways of coming about this. Is it the lack of technology and devices of adequate, or is it really an affordability issue? The second piece that's listed is also need services, devices, outreach, training, and support to be offered in language. This is probably far more important in terms of what we're looking at in San Francisco. And then it says, in addition, aging individuals often lack the digital skills and training opportunities needed to use technology. This gives a narrative overview. What it does then, and you'll find this for each section, it took me a while to figure this out, but it lists the goal, and this goal has to do with affordability. So goal number 2, and then lists objectives, and it's this baseline is where things are right now based on their survey. The second piece that concerns me and Andrew as we're looking through is that some of the data that they cite is really not very, for older adults, is not that different than the population in general. So, you know, sometimes just 1 or 2 percentage points in difference. So it doesn't tell us very much. In terms of this piece, for example, reduce the average cost that covered populations pay for service. I think this is really important statewide. And I think probably could be for everybody on this. And I don't know that it's specific to older adults. It says older adults pay, looks like about $2.30 more a month than Californians on average. In rural areas, this is much greater. It can be as much as $25 more. So hard to say. And this is just another example. We'll jump to the section on disability next. But if you take a look at where I've highlighted it in yellow, they're pointing out 34% of aging individuals indicated an interest in internet or computer training courses. And that's just 1% higher than overall. So what does that tell us? Not a whole lot. 24% of online survey respondents who identify as aging individuals say they do not have access to technical support services in their household and community. 2% greater than general, than everybody. Again, not super helpful. And they never define what technical services are. So it's not clear if they mean hardware or questions like our tech support pop-ups. It doesn't define that term. The third, it says 20% of online respondents who identified as aging individuals are unfamiliar with cybersecurity. True. Again, just 2% greater. So those are not as significant. The one piece of data that I did find more significant was 56% of overall telephone survey respondents were found to have advanced digital skills. Just 42% of aging individuals reported the same. This is the only significant data or difference in terms of with overall population. That I think is significant. And this is exactly the same for individuals with disabilities. The exact same sentence is used. I think it's 56 to 43% for individuals with disabilities. So it's kind of an interesting piece, but that's really it. That's all they have on aging, and they don't provide any more specifics on that. Any comments, questions? You can jump in or raise your hand.
Carla, I have a question.
Yes.
My name is
Yes.
Shalini.
Okay.
Is there any success stories in that plan? What has worked?
Oh, success stories. There is a section on assets of things that work, and they're also in the strategies. There is far less emphasis on it, though, in the plan than you might think. They have lists, and it says working with trusted community partners is critical to digital equity, things like that. So they have a couple quite general types of suggestions that are, using what's worked then to make recommendations. But
Okay.
there aren't as many specific success stories.
Okay. And that were not part of the questions in the surveys. Like, when they ask what would work for them, and, we want to build these plans, but that was not the part. Looks like.
Well, to be perfectly honest, they did ask that a lot. Okay. And so I'm wondering if it's going to be in other sections, because they did ask in every meeting we're in, and in all of the statewide meetings, they were showcasing organizations who were doing programs that worked. One of their recommendations is to continue and to formalize a statewide vehicle for sharing best practices. And it didn't say success stories, but I think best practices emerging from those stories. But in the report itself doesn't contain those.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
say, Shalini, in the outcome area work groups, like in healthcare, for example, they would ask, any kind of practices that work well, so for example, community health workers were raised a lot as one kind of way that they could engage with population, share information, and provide some initial kind of help with technology.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Any other comments?
Sure. So Carla and Andrew,
Yeah.
thank you and everyone at Tech Council for hosting this today. This is excellent and very informative. In terms of like the national discrepancy with the FCC broadband map, that's a significant discrepancy. Would you say the discrepancy in the data that we're looking at in the draft state digital equity plan is also significant? Could you classify it as significant or marginal or just iffy? Because those numbers that you showed were very close to the actual numbers of population, which doesn't so much. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would split that data question up into a couple. So there's the data from the phone and online surveys, which, and that's what we have to figure out how they're drawing these conclusions. They also do talk about issues with data, and there is a section that does say in the report, and that it becomes a key priority, is to create and develop better and more accurate broadband maps for California, because many people who filled it out, participants, indicated dead zones, or that it wasn't where it shows on the map you have it, you don't. And that was in multiple unit dwellings, that was in different things like that. So they did hear that, and they did indicate that going forward, that needs more attention and more accuracy. Now, the kinds of numbers we were pointing at today in this, in terms of being like 1 or 2% as opposed to the general population, what I think some of that comes from is that they're kind of like all put together across the state. They weren't really looking at immigrant populations or people who speak a language other than English. And I think that is actually where you're going to find some significant degrees. Those groups were significantly undersampled and underrepresented. And that's why those voices are not in this document to the extent that they probably should be. They note some of the concerns, but just by sheer numbers, 91% were filled out in English and almost all online. That tells you that there's something amiss.
Yeah, and Rich, like Carla said, they do kind of recognize in the report that even for the Broadband for All action plan, that granularity and accuracy in the broadband data was a challenge and a concern. It continues to be a concern, especially what the maps tell them and what they hear from the communities. So maybe part of this public comment is, if you do see data points that don't reflect your kind of experience in terms of the populations or communities you're working in, to share that, because it is explicitly recognized in the reports that data is an issue. So.
I know we just have a few more minutes, but I want to pull this out, and I think this is worth actually another meeting. What's interesting is I showed you that section for older adults. For incarcerated individuals, it is a huge section that they've devoted to that. And veterans is also interesting. If you take a look at the numbers, 75% of the veterans were 60 and over. So So some of these, it's like they should maybe do a little bit more combining. I want to get to the section on individuals with disabilities and take a look at the top 3 priorities that they have. I do think that they did a better job for individuals with disabilities than they did for aging individuals. They seem to be more comprehensive, and they intentionally oversampled just to make sure that they were getting enough feedback in this. What strikes me first, and we have others on the call, is San Francisco, and many of you participated in Empowered Cities Technology Needs Survey for particularly directed at people in the disability community. And these things did come up. But the number one thing that came up was affordability over and above these in terms of what we saw in San Francisco. I don't know if others have other thoughts on this, or if this set of like 3 things rings true for you, and we can delve further. But just right now, I'm curious as to your reactions. Cynthia, I see that you're on, and I will bug you.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought is that does seem pretty accurate. Inadequate accessibility to hardware, software, training on hardware, software, accessibility of online services. Those do seem to be the main challenges. And of course, we've been working to address them. We've been distributing tablets to our clients and providing training. But yeah, that's my first thought.
So it looks good. Okay, I'm glad. I wanted to hear from folks because my initial thought was that as well. They looked like they had a little bit more. Oh, and there we are, Community Living Campaign, San Francisco Tech Council, and a couple of other, were listed under this section. But they did seem to point to about key pieces. This I did think was interesting about, and it was, I only pointed when there are differences in significant statistical differences. It says about 3/4 of respondents who identified as having a disability rarely or never used the internet to search for available housing, compared to 63% for the overall online public survey respondents. And so that seems to be a very specific area that could be helpful. Well, we're looking forward to seeing all of you in the new year, and over the next couple of weeks, we'll be generating some material on this, and if you have ideas or thoughts about this, please get in touch with us.